James and Victoria had been together for 7 years, but lately their marriage felt like a carefully navigated minefield. The arguments were subtle at first and #X2014, passive comments about work priorities, the way she looked at her phone during dinner, his tendency to withdraw into himself after a difficult day at the office. They and #X2019 scheduled this hiking trip to Cascadia National Forest as a last attempt at rediscovery, though neither had explicitly said so. Victoria packed in tense silence while James checked the weather forecast 3 times, both pretending they weren't and #X2019, secretly hoping the trip would somehow reset them. The hike was meant to take 3 hours. They and #X2019 taken a wrong turn somewhere in the dense undergrowth, arguing about the map while the afternoon light fractured through the canopy in golden shaft. It was Victoria who spotted it first. A narrow ravine lined with moss-covered stones, leading down to what looked like steam rising from below. Without waiting for James and #X2019's opinion, she descended. He followed, because that and #X2019's what he always did and #X2014. He followed Victoria. They had met in university, and he and #X2019 been following her lead ever since. The spring was hidden in a bowl of ancient rock, sheltered by towering cedars and circled by ferns that seemed impossibly lush. Steam curled from the water in delicate spirals, and the air smelled like minerals and deep earth. For the first time in months, Victoria smiled and #X2014, a genuine smile, not one of those practiced expressions she wore at dinner parties. And #X201C. This is incredible, and #X201D. She whispered, already beginning to undress. James hesitated. The place felt too perfect, too untouched. But Victoria was already in the water, her hair floating around her shoulders, steam rising off her skin. She looked beautiful in a way he and #X2019 forgotten she could and #X2014. Not beautiful the way a photograph is beautiful, but beautiful in her absolute presence, alive and unguarded. He joined her, and for the first time in months, they held each other without it being awkward or purposeful. His hands found her waist, and she kissed him like she meant it, like she was trying to remember why she and #X2019 fallen in love with him in the first place. It was during this intimate moment, with Victoria and #X2019 back against the warm rock and James and #X2019 lips on her neck, that they heard the sound. At first, James thought it was his own heartbeat, but Victoria stiffened beneath him. It was a high-pitched whimper, almost like a child crying. They pulled apart, and Victoria instinctively covered herself with her arms. And #X201C. What was that? And #X201D. Behind the curved edge of rock, something moved. James waded out of the water, his body suddenly tense, protective. What emerged from the ferns was impossible. A woman with auburn hair, except her ears were pointed and her eyes reflected light like an animal, and #X2019. She was thin, soaking wet, and cradled in her arms was something small and furry. Behind them, the sound of dogs barking echoed through the ravine, and #X2014, the distinctive shouts of men with guns. And #X201C, please, and #X201D. The woman gasped, her voice barely human. And #X201C. They and #X2019. Re-hunting us. Hide us. Please. And #X201D. Without thinking, James grabbed her arm and pulled her deeper into the spring and #X2019's shelter. Victoria had already found a shallow cave behind the waterfall, and they huddled there, the strange woman cradling her small kit, and #X2014, because that and #X2019 what James realized it was, a fox child, though not entirely a fox, and #X2014, while the voices of the hunters faded into the distance. The spring seemed to embrace them, the water warm and protective. When it was safe, the foxwoman told them her name was Cora, and her small one was Asha. She was a guardian of the spring, she explained, her kind bound to protect places of power for centuries. But the poachers had discovered her, had been tracking her for weeks. Cora had been trying to escape, to lead them away, but Asha couldn't and #X2019, run fast enough. And #X201C, you saved us, and #X201D, she said, looking at them with eyes that seemed ancient and grateful. And #X201C, you saved us when you could have turned away, and #X201D. James and Victoria exchanged glances. Their relationship had been crumbling, but in that moment they were united by something neither could explain, and #X2014, a feeling that they had been placed at that spring for a reason. They helped Cora dry off, shared their packed food, and stayed through the night, listening to her speak about the magic that flowed through this place, about the bond that formed between those who protected it willingly. By dawn, they realized they couldn't and #X2019, leave her there alone. And #X201C, come with us, and #X201D, Victoria heard herself say. And #X201C, just for a few days. Until the hunters give up, and #X201D. She looked at James, and he nodded. Neither of them understood why they were making this offer, but it felt right, like the first decision they and #X2019 made together in years that actually meant something. Their cabin wasn't and #X2019 far, just a 5-mile hike through the forest. They and #X2019 rented it for the week, wanting solitude to repair their marriage, though they hadn't and #X2019 discussed the specifics of what needed repairing. Now, they found themselves explaining to a supernatural foxwoman where the towels were and which bedroom she could use. The surreality of it should have frightened them, but instead, there was an odd comfort in having something external to focus on besides their deteriorating relationship. Cora settled in with an ease that suggested she and #X2019 lived among humans before. Asha, the kit, was less graceful. She followed Victoria everywhere, her movements jerky and anxious, occasionally shifting between a fox form and an almost human one. She would pad behind Victoria as she made breakfast, climb onto her lap while they watched television, and sleep curled against her back at night. James, meanwhile, found Cora watching him with an intensity that was disconcerting. On their second evening, while Victoria was in the shower, Cora approached James on the back porch. She moved with an unnatural grace, her feet barely making a sound on the wooden planks. And #X201C, you are in pain, and #X201D, she said, not as a question. And #X201C, you and your mate. I can feel it like a wound in the air. And #X201D, James wanted to deny it, to maintain the comfortable fiction that everything was fine, but something about her knowing gaze dissolved his defenses. And #X201C, we and #X2019, grown apart, and #X201D. He found himself confessing. And #X201C, I dawn and #X2019, know when it happened. One day we were happy, and the next day we were just and #X2014, existing. Going through motions, and #X201D. Cora listened, and as she listened, strange things began to happen. The air around them grew warmer. The plants on the porch seemed to lean toward him. Somewhere in the distance, birds began singing, though it was nearly 9 at night. And #X201C. The spring has made you aware to magic, and #X201D, Cora said softly. And #X201C, your intention to protect us, that act of pure kindness, it and #X2019, marked you both, and #X201D. When Victoria emerged from the shower, wrapped in a white towel, her hair dripping down her back, she found Cora and James standing very close on the porch, talking quietly. Something flickered across Victoria and hashtag X 2019, S face and hashtag X 2014, jealousy, maybe, or fear. Cora simply smiled and excused herself, leaving James to watch Victoria approach him with an expression he couldn't and hashtag X 2019, T quite read. And hashtag X201C, what was that about? And hashtag X201D, Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. James pulled her close, still damp from the shower, and kissed her. She tasted like the expensive shampoo she always bought, like normalcy, like home. And hashtag X201C, nothing. She was just saying how grateful she is. And hashtag X201D, but it wasn't and hashtag X2019, T nothing. They both knew it. That night, they made love with an urgency they hadn't and hashtag X2019, T felt in months, as if trying to re-establish something that was slipping away. James pressed her against the mattress, her wet hair spreading across the pillow, and Victoria held him like she was trying to keep him from floating away. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and James could have sworn he heard the sound of Cora singing softly from the next room. The third day, they barely left the cabin. Victoria found herself preparing elaborate meals while Asha watched from the kitchen counter, sometimes in fox form, sometimes in the small, ethereal human form she occasionally took. When Victoria cut her hand on a knife, Asha whimpered in distress, and the cut sealed itself. Victoria told herself it was her imagination, but she could feel the magic of it, warm and undeniable. Similarly, James noticed that every time he needed something, it seemed to appear. The weather cleared when they wanted to walk. A bird they were trying to identify landed on the porch railing. The coffee he preferred was somehow always available. By evening, both James and Victoria were aware of a subtle but persistent ache in their chests. It wasn't and hashtag X2019, T painful, more like an awareness of something growing, something taking root. Cora, sensing this, tried to explain. And hashtag X201C, the spring chooses its guardians carefully, and hashtag X201D, she said, sitting between them on the couch while Asha curled between Victoria and hashtag X2019, S ankles. And hashtag X201C, when you protected us with nothing but kindness, no expectation of reward, you initiated a bond. The spring recognizes your intention. It wants to keep you. And hashtag X201D. And hashtag X201C. What do you mean, keep us? And hashtag X201D, James asked, though he was afraid he already knew. Victoria and hashtag X2019. S hand found his beneath the blanket they were sharing. Outside, the wind seemed to pick up, carrying with it a sound almost like laughter. Or singing. Or both. And hashtag X201C. It means you belong to the forest now, and hashtag X201D, Cora said gently. And hashtag X201C. And I, in turn, belong to you. And hashtag X201D. By day 4, they could no longer deny what was happening. James woke to find vines growing across the cabin wall in patterns that were almost deliberate, forming shapes that looked like protection runes. The coffee maker worked without being plugged in. The water from the tap was always the perfect temperature. But more unsettling was the way they couldn't and hashtag X2019, think about leaving. Every time James considered it, his chest constricted painfully, and Victoria would clutch at him, her eyes wide with panic. They needed answers. James drove to the nearest town while Victoria and Cora stayed at the cabin, supposedly keeping Asha company but really, he suspected, growing closer. At the local library, with the librarian and hashtag X2019, skeptical help, he researched local history. He found mention of the spring, called the spirit and hashtag X2019, breath in old journal entries from the 1920s. Multiple people had disappeared near it. A whole family had vanished without a trace after reporting and hashtag X201C, strange lights and hashtag X201D, and hashtag X201C, beautiful singing, and #X201D, James and #X2019. Hands trembled as he photographed the articles. When he returned, Victoria and Cora were in the kitchen, and the intimacy of the scene struck him like a physical blow. Victoria was sitting on the counter, her legs dangling, and Cora stood between them, her hands on Victoria and #X2019's thighs. They weren't and #X2019 kissing, but they were close enough that the space between them seemed to vibrate with intention. Asha, from her perch on the windowsill, looked at James with ancient eyes. And #X201C. James and #X201D. Cora said, turning to face him with no shame, only honesty. And #X201C. We need to talk about what the binding truly means. And #X201D. They settled at the table, and Cora explained. When humans protected the sacred places, when they acted from pure intention, the spring claimed them as guardians. But guardianship wasn't and #X2019 TA position, it was a transformation. The marked ones slowly ceased to age, to truly leave. They became as much a part of the forest as the trees and rivers. And #X201C, you and #X2019, saying we can never leave, and #X201D. Victoria said quietly. And #X201C, you and #X2019, saying we and #X2019, trapped, and #X201D. And #X201C, I and #X2019, am saying you and #X2019, chosen and #X201D, Cora corrected gently. And #X201C. And yes, there is a cost. But there is also a gift. And #X201D. She extended her hand, and where her skin met the air, it seemed to shimmer. And #X201C. I have been alone for 300 years. Asha is the first kit I and #X2019 had in 100. The solitude is exquisite, but it is also unbearable. I have been waiting for this. And #X201D. James felt something crack inside his chest. Rage maybe. Fear. The knowledge that his careful life, his job waiting back in the city, his apartment with the mortgage, his carefully constructed normalcy and #X2014, it was all gone now. He looked at Victoria, expecting anger, but instead found her looking at Cora with an expression he couldn't and #X2019 quite name. That night they fought. It was the first honest fight they and #X2019 had in months, maybe years. James accused Victoria of being willing to throw her life away. She accused him of always needing everything explained and rational. He said she was being seduced by magic and loneliness. She said he was being closed off and stubborn, just like always. They hurt each other in the way only people who know each other intimately can, words sharp and precise and devastating. But as the night deepened, as the anger burned itself out, they found themselves on the cabin and #X2019's back porch, sitting on the steps, shoulders touching in the darkness. The forest around them was alive with nocturnal sounds and the faint scent of the distant spring. And #X201C, I and #X2019, been so unhappy and #X201D, Victoria whispered. And #X201C, for so long. And coming here, meeting her, it and #X2019, the first time I and #X2019, felt alive in years. And #X201D. James took her hand. And #X201C. I know, and #X201D, he said. And #X201C. So have I, and #X201D. They sat like that for hours, not talking, just breathing together. And somewhere in the darkness they heard Cora singing, a sound that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a song that seemed to contain all the loneliness of 3 centuries. On the 5th day, James made a decision. He called the authorities. not to report Cora and hashtag X 2014. He could never do that and hashtag X 2014, but to organize an operation against the poachers. He sat in the ranger station and described the hunters, their guns, their intent to capture or kill an endangered species. It was all technically true. Within hours, he and hashtag X 2019 set in motion a series of events that would flood the forest with officials and protection. Victoria found out when she overheard his phone call. Instead of the anger he expected, she simply nodded. And hashtag X201C. I was thinking about my parents, and hashtag X201D, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed while James stood by the window. And hashtag X201C. About how I Haven and hashtag X 2019. T called them in 4 days and they and hashtag X 2019. Probably worried sick. About how if I just and hashtag X 2014. Disappear and hashtag X 2014. It will destroy them. I was trying to convince myself that it would be okay, that this is worth that pain. But I was lying. And hashtag X201D. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. And hashtag X201C. So maybe what you did was right. Maybe we need to choose, not have the choice made for us. And hashtag X201D. When they told Cora, the fox woman, and hashtag X2019, S expression shattered like glass. She looked at them for a long moment and Asha, sensing her distress, transformed fully into a small fox and hid her face against Cora and hashtag X2019. S neck. And hashtag X201C, you and hashtag X2019, rejecting the binding, and hashtag X201D, Cora said. It was and hashtag X2019, TA question. And hashtag X201C, we and hashtag X2019, choosing freedom, and hashtag X201D, Victoria said, and James heard the tremor in her voice. And hashtag X201C, but not the freedom to leave the forest forever. The freedom to choose. If you want us to come back, if you need us, we will. But not as prisoners. As guardians, yes. But by choice. And hashtag X201D. The physical ache that had been building in their chests suddenly intensified, and both James and Victoria gasped, falling to their knees. Cora moved to help them, but Victoria held up a hand. And hashtag X201C, no. This is what breaking a binding feels like. We need to feel it. We need to accept it. And hashtag X201D. The pain was extraordinary and hashtag X2014, like something vital being pulled from their chests, leaving wounds behind. But within it, there was also a strange relief, a sense of weight being lifted. When it passed, they were changed. Not in appearance, but in some fundamental way. They could feel the forest still, but as something external to them, something they could choose to return to, rather than something that had to hold them. James found that he could think about his job, his apartment, his old life without pain. But he also knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't and hashtag X2019, return to it. And hashtag X201C. What will you do now? And hashtag X201D, James asked Cora, who had retreated to the window, her silhouette stark against the evening light. And hashtag X201C, return to the spring, and hashtag X201D, she said quietly. And hashtag X201C, it has protected me for so long. Perhaps now it will protect me from loneliness instead of confinement. And hashtag X201D, she turned to look at them. And hashtag X201C, but you will return. And hashtag X201D. Victoria crossed the room and, without hesitation, kissed Cora. It was a kiss full of affection and sorrow and a strange sort of promise. And hashtag X201C. Yes, and hashtag X201D, she said. And hashtag X201C. We will return. Not as bound guardians, but as people who choose to protect you. As people who choose to come home. And hashtag X201D. That night, the three of them were together. James and Victoria on either side of Cora, their hands intertwined, Asha curled across their lap. It was an and #X 2019. Romantic in the traditional sense, though there were elements of romance to it. It was more than that, it was communion. It was the acknowledgement of something real that transcended categories and definitions. The forest seemed to sing around them, a sound that might have been wind in the trees or something far more intentional. And #X201C, I and #X 2019, am scared, and #X201D, James admitted as the night deepened. And #X201C, of what comes next, of what people will say, of whether we can really live like this, between worlds. And #X201D, and #X201C, I and #X 2019, V lived between worlds for 300 years, and #X201D, Cora said, her voice carrying an echo of ancient wisdom. And #X201C, it is possible. It is beautiful. And more importantly, you will have each other. And #X201D, Victoria squeezed James and #X 2019's hand and he squeezed back. The Rangers arrived 3 days later. James had left detailed instructions about the hunters, and their operation was swift and professional. The poachers were arrested. The forest was declared a protected sanctuary, its boundaries expanded to include the hidden spring. James and Victoria cooperated fully with the investigation, giving statements and even testifying before a judge via video conference from the cabin. Officially, they claimed to be conducting independent research on the spring and #X 2019's unique ecosystem. No one questioned it, and Cora remained undetected. In the meantime, they made difficult phone calls. Victoria and #X 2019's mother wept with relief when she heard her daughter and #X 2019's voice. James and #X 2019's boss expressed concern when he told her he was taking an indefinite leave of absence. There were conversations with lawyers about their home, their possessions, their former lives. Slowly and deliberately, they dismantled the structures of their old existence. They made arrangements for their apartment to be sold, for most of their belongings to be donated or stored. They told no one about Cora, about the spring, about the magic. That was a secret that belonged only to them. When the legal matters were sorted, when the Rangers had set up their monitoring stations and left the forest to its new protection, James and Victoria made their choice official. They resigned from their jobs via email. They transferred what money they could into accounts that didn't and #X 2019 require regular maintenance. They left the cabin and drove back to the city to settle their affairs in person, but everyone could tell they were already gone, already belonging to the forest. On their last night in the city, lying in their apartment one final time, Victoria said, and #X201C, do you think we and #X 2019 crazy? And #X201D, James traced patterns on her bare shoulder, the lamplight catching the gold in her hair. And #X201C, completely, and #X201D, he answered. And #X201C, but for the first time in years, I feel sane. And #X201D, Victoria turned to face him, and they made love slowly and deliberately, acknowledging that this was the end of an era, even as it was the beginning of something new. Afterward, as she slept against his chest, James listened to the city sounds beyond the window and felt not a single moment of regret. They returned to the forest on a morning that felt like blessing. The cabin had been closed for weeks, but when they opened the door, they found it warm and welcoming. The plants on the porch had grown but not invaded. The beds were made with fresh sheets. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation. They walked to the spring as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Cora was waiting for them at the water and #X 2019's edge, Asha playing in fox form on the rocks. When she saw them, Cora transformed fully, her human form perfect and ethereal. and hashtag X201C. You came back, and hashtag X201D, she said, and it wasn't and hashtag X2019. TA statement but a question, as if she was still afraid they might vanish. And hashtag X201C. We promised, and hashtag X201D, James said. He and Victoria took off their clothes and entered the water. It was warm and welcoming, and as they submerged themselves, they felt the last threads of their former lives dissolve. The spring embraced them, not as a captor but as a sanctuary. As the stars emerged, James floated on his back, Victoria beside him, Cora singing to Asha on the rocks. He thought about all the people they and hashtag X2019 D left behind, all the explanations that would never quite satisfy. He thought about the years of disconnection that had led them to this hidden place. But mostly, he thought about the feel of Victoria and hashtag X2019's hand finding his beneath the water, about the absolute rightness of this choice. Over the following months and years, they built a new life. They maintained the cabin as a home base, though increasingly they spent their time at the spring or in the deep forest. James began documenting the ecosystem, publishing under various names to protect Cora and hashtag X2019's existence. Victoria started a blog about sustainable forest living, gradually drawing like-minded people to the area while carefully ensuring that the sacred places remained hidden and protected. Their relationship transformed as well. No longer struggling against each other, they found their rhythm. James became the anchor, the one who handled logistics and connections to the outside world. Victoria became the bridge, able to communicate with Cora in ways James sometimes struggled with, translating between human and magical realms. And Cora, slowly over years, began to trust that she was not alone, that the binding she and hashtag X2019 D feared had driven them away had instead been transformed into something chosen, something real. One evening, 5 years after that first fateful hike, James found Victoria sitting at the spring and hashtag X2019's edge, her feet in the water, Cora and hashtag X2019's head resting on her lap. Asha, now nearly as large as her mother, played with a deer fawn that had wandered down from the forest above. And hashtag X201C. I was thinking, and hashtag X201D. Victoria said, looking up at him with a smile, and hashtag X201C. About the marriage counseling we were supposedly here to do on that first trip, and hashtag X201D. James laughed and sat beside her, taking her hand. And hashtag X201C. I think we worked it out, and hashtag X201D, he said. They didn't and hashtag X2019 T-kiss, but they leaned against each other, a gesture more intimate after 5 years of genuine partnership than any kiss could be. Above them, the forest canopy formed a cathedral of green, and the spring sang its eternal song. In the distance, they heard voices on the hiking trail, tourists and nature enthusiasts looking for waterfalls and rare bird. They had no idea that near them, hidden behind a certain pattern of ancient rocks and protected by magic older than memory, 3 humans and a foxwoman had built a life that existed between worlds. A life that had been forged not through compulsion, but through the most powerful magic of all, choice, love, and the determination to protect what you find sacred. The spring would protect them for as long as they wished to stay. And they would protect the spring, not because they were bound, but because they had finally learned the difference between obligation and devotion. The end.